Hello, and thank you for joining me today as we begin our discussion on the respiratory system, which is going to be Unit 7 for my A&P course. So for starters, this section specifically is going to be organs of the respiratory system. And today, my objectives for you are to be able to differentiate between respiration and ventilation, name and label the organs of the respiratory system, describe the nasal cavity and the importance of a mucous membrane lining, and then identify our four sinuses in the skull and explain why we have them, what's important about them, and so on and so forth. So for starters, respiration. We talk about respiration in the respiratory system. Respiration is the exchanging of gas between the atmosphere and body cells. And so along with this, you have ventilation, which is our first little bulleted term here. Ventilation is the movement of air in and out of the lungs. So as you breathe in, you breathe out. That is ventilation. You're moving air in, moving air out. That's what this term means. When we're talking respiration, which is the exchanging of gas, so not just moving air in and out, but actually exchanging those molecules, we have two kinds. We have external, we have internal. External respiration is the exchange between the lungs and the blood. So this goes from the lungs, which is where air goes into your body, into then your bloodstream, where it can be taken to your cells. So external goes from the lungs to the blood. Internal then goes from the blood to your body cells. So external is lungs to blood, internal is blood to body cells. So the connecting piece there is your blood, specifically your red blood cells, which contain hemoglobin, which contain iron, which carry the oxygen specifically, like we talked in the last unit. Okay, all this together works for respiration and what we call, and ventilation is included in that, which is moving air in and out of the lungs. We also have this term called cellular respiration, which you've learned previously, in which oxygen utilization and production of CO2 by the body. This is where we produce our energy and our waste products and why we breathe out carbon dioxide. Okay, so respiration, again, exchanging between gas between the atmosphere and the body cells. And so the basics of this is that we use the oxygen in the air and we consume sugars. And we break our foods down into sugars. And so then our sugars can combine with oxygen to produce carbon dioxide and water. This is the essence of cellular respiration. A sugar plus oxygen produces carbon dioxide and water. And that is why we do respiration at all and why we have a respiratory system, is to perform that function. Okay, some organs that are involved here. So some important pieces that we need in order to make this all work. One, we use our nose. And our nose opens into this nasal cavity, which we're going to talk about. Within your nasal cavity, you have these things called sinuses, which we'll mention. And then from there, it goes into your pharynx, then your larynx, your trachea, your bronchial tree, which are these branches here off your trachea. Then into your lungs, into your capillary system, then it's in your blood. And we're going to talk about all of that, but those are just kind of the basics on the organs of your respiratory system. Okay, so your nose specifically, this is the opening in your face that allows air into the body. This is made of bone, muscle, and cartilage. You have these internal hairs inside your nose hairs, which prevent large particles from getting into your respiratory system, which can then block your trachea and your lungs, which can cause all kinds of problems. Also behind your nose, you have this thing called the nasal cavity. This is your hollow space behind or within your nose. It's divided by your nasal septum, which is cartilage, which separates your left and right nostrils. Your nasal cavity is separated from your cranial cavity by your ethmoid bone. So think clear back to Unit 3, we did bones. We talked about the ethmoid bone. That's what separates our brain and our cranial cavity from our nose and our nasal cavity. Okay? And then this is, our nasal cavity is then divided into passages. These are called your superior, middle, and inferior meatus, or your nasal concha as well. Okay? So these are your three pieces here, which we also looked at when we talked about the skeletal system. So here you see this picture down below. You have your superior, your middle, and your inferior concha. That's these grooves here which funnel air down into your pharynx and eventually transfer it to the lungs. Okay, continuing on with the nasal cavity, it also has this mucous membrane lining. This is really important. You have cells in your nasal cavity which are designed to produce mucus. And the reason they produce mucus is to clean the air. So when air travels over the mucus, dust particles get caught, small particles get caught, and then they can be disposed so they don't get into your lungs and cause infection. It also acts as a location and helps with warming the air before it reaches your lungs. So this mucus helps to warm your air. The nasal cavity warms your air before it goes to your lungs so you don't freeze your lungs out when you are outside on a cold day, like we get sometimes here in Nebraska. We also have cells with cilia, these tiny hairs that move mucus towards the pharynx. So as you get particles caught in the mucus, the cilia move the mucus towards the pharynx, where then it can be swallowed and sent to your stomach, where things die. And so one of the issues with things like smoking is smoking actually destroys your mucus lining, which means that you can't then filter these particles, which lead to more issues in your respiratory system. Continuing on, I mentioned we're going to learn about sinuses. So we talk about sinus infections and things like that, but what is a sinus itself? And so a sinus is an air-filled space in bone. So it's essentially a hollow part of bone that its main function is to reduce the weight of the bone, from what we understand. And so you have 4 of them in your skull. You have a frontal sinus, a maxillary sinus, a sphenoid sinus, and an ethmoid sinus. So frontal is found in your frontal bone, ethmoid in your ethmoid bone, sphenoid in your sphenoid bone, maxillary in your maxillary bone. These are your sinuses. When you get infections, they fill up with mucus, and so instead of being full of air, they're full of mucus, and that's why they hurt and ache. Okay, and so again, mucus from your sinuses drain into your nasal cavity. Membranes are swelled because of infections or allergies. This is your inflammation, and this is it's called sinusitis, which is sinu refers to the sinuses, itis refers to inflammation. This can cause pressure, sometimes even headaches. Okay, so these are some review questions for our first section. Look these over, make sure you can answer them, have an idea about them. If you have questions, please talk to me when you return to class, and I will see you next time.